artificial intelligence will completely transform our world. But what is AI? Why will it affect you? And how can you and your business survive and thrive through the AI revolution? Welcome to AI and You. Here is your host, author, speaker, and futurist, Peter Scott.
Hi, we're up to episode 270. As my guest today says, how is it that we, a piece of furniture of the universe like a rock or a star or a tree, can love or hate or see or hear? What, in other words, makes us conscious? And what does that mean? He is the cognitive scientist Christof Koch, known for his work exploring the substrate of consciousness in humans, animals, and machines. He is the author of more than 350 peer-reviewed publications and 5 books, the latest of which is Then I Am Myself the World, What Consciousness Is and How to Expand It. A physicist and neurobiologist, he was for more than a quarter of a century a professor of biology and engineering at the California Institute of Technology in Pasadena. In 2011, he became the chief scientist at the Allen Institute for Brain Science in Seattle, and in 2015, its president. Now he's its meritorious investigator. He is also the chief scientist of the Tiny Blue Dot Foundation in Santa Monica, seeking to understand consciousness, its place in nature, and how this knowledge can benefit all of humanity. Why is an AI show interested in consciousness? Because the questions constantly arise, is AI conscious? How will we know when it is? How can or should we make it conscious? And if we can't answer those questions for human beings, how will we answer them for anything else? We're going to talk about, oh my gosh, this is deep stuff, the relationships between existence, identity, quantum mechanics, language, and consciousness, and cosmic consciousness. How conscious parts of your body might be, connecting brains to each other, including an example that's already happened, and opera. It will be possibly literally mind-blowing. So let's get into the interview. Oh, Christof Koch, it's a pleasure to welcome you to AI and You. Neuroscientist in the house, folks, and we have a fascinating discussion here ahead of us about the nature of consciousness. And firstly, I'd like to ask you how you got into this field, because I'm always fascinated by the path that took someone into something so pivotal as examining what makes us think, what makes us who we are. Can you tell us about your background and how you got into neuroscience and consciousness?
Yeah, so already as an undergrad, my degree is actually in physics, and I had a minor in philosophy since I was interested in this question. It's really a fundamental question that at some point most people ask themselves, that voice inside my head, the image, the movie I see, how does that come about? The pain I have, the pleasure I have, when I'm bored, dreading, fearing, loving, all of those things. How can a piece of furniture of the universe, like anything else, like a rock or a star or tree, subject to the same laws of quantum mechanics and relativity, etc., how can such a piece of matter love or hate or see or hear? And so after my PhD, I spent some time at MIT, and there I met Francis Crick, the molecular biologist who co-discovered with Jim Watson the helical shape of the DNA molecule of heredity, and who was very interested in this question. And then this was in the late 1980s, so last century, last millennium, and early 1990s. And then we published a series of like 20 papers and 2 books where we articulated a purely empirical program to study the footprints of consciousness in the brain of people, of regular folks, of patients, and of animals that are closely related, like monkeys and cats and mice and rats and other animals. Because it's such a fundamental question. I mean, we can go back to the French philosopher René Descartes, 400 years ago, who famously made this sort of the most famous deduction in Western thought, cogito ergo sum, in Latin, in French, je pense, donc je suis. In modern language, I'm conscious, therefore I am. Ultimately, the only way I know that I exist is because I fear, I love, I see, I hear. Otherwise, I have no knowledge that I even exist. And so this is really at the heart of all of our lives. And even if I'm a scientist, well, I have to look at an oscilloscope. I have to listen to the chatter of a Geiger counter. So I filter everything I know about the world is filtered through my conscious perception of it. So I cannot elide consciousness. And leaving it out in science, as contemporary science does, because the foundational equation of relativity and quantum mechanics, right, our foundational theories about the world, there's nothing there about consciousness. Periodic table of chemical elements, nothing about consciousness. Biology, you can look at the endless ATGC chart of our nucleotide in our genes, nothing about consciousness. Yet here we are in the world, every day we become conscious again, only then to lose consciousness or at night when we go back into deep sleep. So science has to rise to this challenge. And so therefore we had this pragmatic program, forget about philosophy. We haven't made all that much progress in 2000 years. Let's just focus on which bits and pieces of the body in general, or today we know the brain is the organ of consciousness, which bits and pieces of the brain are actually the substrate of any type of experience or of any one particular experience.
So Descartes is saying that the act of thinking establishes the identity. Like we could all be programs running in a simulation somewhere, but the fact that we're still thinking gives us that identity, even if it is a circuit somewhere. Yes.
Existence. It's all about existence. How do you know that you exist? Well, because, and he was very clear, that there might be an evil deceiver. Today we would say computer simulation, all of that. There could be an evil deceiver that sort of deceives what I actually see. I see something, but actually it's very different. Or I feel a body, but actually my body is very different. But what cannot be denied that I am conscious of something. And if I'm deceived, well, then I exist, realizing that there is something to be me. I mean, actually, you can go back to St. Augustine, who said something similar, and then you can go back even further to Aristotle until you hit the bedrock of Western philosophy. So in modern culture, it's most explicitly expressed by Descartes. It's existence. I exist because I know this thing doesn't exist for itself, right? This thing doesn't know that it's conscious, or this thing is much more complicated. iPhone doesn't know it exists. You know, and I know we exist.
Would a disturbing implication of that be that during a time I lose consciousness, that I no longer exist temporarily?
That's entirely correct. You exist for others. So when you go to sleep, so early on at night, you go into what's called deep sleep or delta wave sleep, where you have these slow waves crisscrossing your brain. And typically when subjects get woken up during this phase and you ask them, where were you? Have you had any experience? On average, they say no. So yes, they're not conscious. It changes in the later phase of the night when I wake you up, and people often report dreaming. And then, of course, you do exist. The dreaming consciousness is different from waking consciousness. Typically, you're not highly self-aware, but you love, you hate, you dread, you fight, right? You're certainly conscious. So you don't exist for yourself anymore in deep sleep or in anesthesia, right? In deep surgical level anesthesia. But of course, you still exist for others. Others can look at you. But that's secondary, that's extrinsic, we call it extrinsic existence versus intrinsic existence. Only when you're conscious, you exist for yourself. That's intrinsic existence. That's really the highest form of existence. And anything else is existence for others. Like your sleeping body is certainly existing for your bed partner, but not for yourself, because you aren't there at that point.
Right. And we'll be digging into the intrinsic versus extrinsic quite a bit for obvious reasons later on. You mentioned some physics like quantum physics, and there is, I'm not going to pretend I understand it, but there are apparent intersections of those sciences with consciousness when they talk about the role of an observer. And I wonder whether that's a point where consciousness starts to come into the scientific construction of the world.
Possibly. Yeah, so the traditional sort of Copenhagen interpretation is, it's sometimes also called shut up and calculate. Don't worry about the metaphysical implications of quantum mechanics. Don't worry about what it means for do particles exist when I don't observe those. Those are all unanswerable questions. Just apply the calculus and it works. And it's true. Quantum mechanics is by far our best description of the world that we have in any science, period. But of course, people, this is why people are people. They think more, well, what does it mean? How does an observation come? What does it even mean to observe something? Does it require someone with a PhD in physics to interact with this particle? Or does it require any person or any conscious entity? So some people are now in the foundations of physics, particularly after the last development over the last 20 years, this entanglement. This is what Einstein called a spooky action at a distance, where two entangled particles, let's say, spins or electrons, they could be at opposite ends of the universe, literally. They could be light years away from each other. But as soon as one of these two entangled particles is observed, and, let's say its spin is up, instantaneous, independent of the distance, the state of the other particle is also determined. Well, this is certainly not your grandfather's or grandmother's notion of physicalism or materialism anymore. And some people now in foundational physics are calling for fundamental revision, including, of course, such notable physicists as Roger Penrose, and reformulating the laws of nature to incorporate consciousness at this rock bottom. So that's ongoing work. There might be a paradigm shift that's ongoing. We'll have to see, but it's very exciting right now, going sort of beyond standard notions of physicalism that is dominant, of course, in academia and throughout in technology and in medicine.
Right. And we're not a show about physics, so I'm going to leave this topic now, although I have to interject that one of the things that's always offended me about quantum physics is the statement about Schrödinger's cat. It could be alive or dead until someone opens the box and looks inside. And I've always felt that the cat should count as an observer. I'm sure that there are ways in which I've got this interpretation wrong, but we'll move on. I like cats, so that's just part of the equation there. We were talking about the title of your book before we started recording, and it's got this really gripping title, Then I Am Myself the World. And you have a really poetic explanation of where that comes from. Perhaps you could enlighten us.
Yeah, so one of the greatest of all operas was written by Richard Wagner, roughly in the middle of the 19th century, called Tristan and Isolde. It's about, the two eponymous lovers. And in the second act, they try to overcome their own identity. So Tristan thinks, I want to become Isolde, and Isolde thinks that she wants to become Tristan. And then to the most rapturous music in the Western canon, they unite. I mean, physically, they obviously make love, but their minds also unite, and they have this, what we today call a mystical experience, where they not only become each other, but they become literally the universe. They feel like there's only one, and that one is now the universe. And in German, they sing, Selbst dann bin ich die Welt, then I am myself the world. So I love this. I had a related mystical experience, and I was so gripped by it. That's why I decided to title my book the way I did.
How did that mystical experience affect your research and your views of consciousness?
It fundamentally shifted. So when I had this experience where whatever remained of me, so in this experience, I lost sense of self, I lost sense of the environment and of the body and of everything. And what remained of me, it wasn't Christof or anything like that, but there was something to be this system, me. And I felt identical. I felt I was part of the entire universe, sort of tapping into some sort of cosmic consciousness, which I know I understand fully. It felt very much, it sounds woo-woo, but that's exactly what I experienced. And of course, this is not an uncommon experience. People have reported this throughout in different cultures and throughout history. And that really shifted it really was like akin to an earthquake in my metaphysical understanding of the universe. This only happened a couple of years ago. And at my age, you formed a pretty solid understanding of what exists and what doesn't exist. And I was always a physicalist, believing, ultimately what truly exists in some fundamental way is, matter and energy and things of that ilk. But now it may well be that I don't have any final ultimate answers, but I'm now much, much more open to views much closer allied to idealism, i.e., like Arthur Schopenhauer, for instance, that what truly exists is mental, is consciousness. And in fact, there may only be a single consciousness, sort of a cosmic or universal or consciousness. You could call it God and you could call it anything else. And matter and energy and all of that manifests itself. It's ultimately a manifestation of something purely mental, purely phenomenal. And this again agrees with you and my knowledge of the world, because we don't directly access atoms. We don't access directly space or time or atoms or energy. All we know about, you and I and every other living sentient creatures, are conscious experiences. And from those we infer, it's an abduction, it's a probabilistic process. We infer, well, based on my observation and my manipulation, my experiment, there's probably a world. There are probably atoms. I can manipulate these atoms to build machines and quantum machines and vaccines and nuclear bombs and all of that. And all of that works. I don't deny any of that. But the question is science just a convenient, operational, almost engineering endeavor? Just practically speaking, science is, well, I measure this, or I manipulate this, and I get that over there. And it works exceedingly well, better than anything else humanity has ever invented. But does it have any metaphysical implications, or is it neutral with respect to the underlying question of what truly exists? And so I've shifted now much more to think about the world and existence in idealistic terms.
Like the potential that the building blocks of the universe are consciousness?
Ultimately, yeah. So Arthur Schopenhauer, so in fact, Richard Wagner, when he wrote Tristan and Isolde, was fully enthralled to having just read The World as Well and Perception, The World as Will and Representation, the major work of Arthur Schopenhauer. Yes, that ultimately what truly exists in a fundamental sense is mental, is phenomenal, is consciousness. And it partly manifests itself in us as, think this, look at this. So that's set of mine, Bernie's mountain dog.
And just for the clarity of listeners who may not be familiar with some of your biography, the experience that you were talking about, that was facilitated or triggered by psychedelics. Is that right?
Well, that's really neither here nor there. It was a particular experience, and as William James, the father of American psychology, emphasized in his book that he wrote in 1906 or something like that, more than 100 years ago, no matter what brought you to this experience, you bring back what he calls a noetic quality. You bring back something that I know, I've seen, I've experienced. Now, other people don't have to buy into it. I totally understand that. And William James make this argument. But for the person who's had this experience, in some sense, it's more real than real, because when you have such an experience, you feel you're finally at home. You're finally at the beating heart of what constitutes existence. It's very, very striking. And so it puts you into this total sort of metaphysical shock. So what did I just, everything else I've done in my life, the last 60 years, how does that agree with it? Well, it still agrees. I mean, I'm still a scientist, I'm still in the lab, etc. But the metaphysical implication of doing science are different from the way I thought about it previously.
Well, and let's talk about this experience of you being, I'm paraphrasing here, and it will be insufficient, but it's the best I can do. You experiencing yourself as part of something much larger, your consciousness extending beyond its present identity. And I will tie this later on to integrated information theory, which we'll be talking about. But I wonder whether you then hold the theory that components can have individual consciousness. In other words, could the cells of your body have their own consciousness? Could we find a consciousness in your gut, which is said to have some neural functions, as well as your brain, as well as other parts of you? Because by analogy, if you can find yourself in a moment where you are experiencing something much bigger than you, can that work in the other way? Can these parts of you also have lesser consciousnesses that combined to form Christof Koch?
Okay, well, so that's a very good question. It's a question that's very difficult. It gets back to a concern of Aristotle, mereology. What defines the whole that's made out of parts, right? It's really all about the relationship between a whole, no matter what you define it, a life, let's say, or conscious entity, and the individual parts. And during mystical experience, you lose your own sense of self. So it's not Christof with his memory and his knowledge and experience of his body, but means this is always awkward. Language fails us here. What the thing, whatever was there of me left experienced was the whole. So because right now I and you, I submit the same, I don't have experience as, let's say, a left brain consciousness and a right brain consciousness. There's only one. When I look at the world, I don't see a left view superimposed on the right view, superimposed onto, feeling my feet on the ground here. There's only one unitary experience. So I have no knowledge of any other potential conscious system inside this entity that constitutes me. Now, it's a different question whether by themselves. So if I take a neuron by itself, would that neuron by itself be conscious? But right now, I would submit that my brain, there isn't a left consciousness, a right consciousness, or a liver consciousness, or heart consciousness. I have no knowledge of those experiences, and I would submit that's not the case. So the challenge of idealism, all of these different metaphysical beliefs, materialism, dualism, panpsychism, idealism, they have, of course, major challenges, which is why sort of philosophers haven't agreed on what is the relevant view to describe all the universe. The challenge of idealism is precisely to explain, well, if there's only one consciousness, one mind, why is there you? I don't access your mind, clearly. I don't access the mind of my wife, and I'm very familiar with her for many, many years. But, as we know through experience, people could be having affairs, there could be spies, it could be an actor. You never, in the full analysis, know exactly what the other experiences, right? This is the problem of other minds. So why is that the case? Why don't we all access all the time everyone's consciousness? So it's an unsolved question. It's called the issue of dissociative boundaries. So there seems to be, most of the time, you are you and I'm me, but it may be that under special circumstances, which we don't understand how they arise, then we might be able to access this whole universal mind. Very good question.
Well, and I usually don't bring this up until much later, but I think we're already there. You talk about not accessing your wife's mind. If we look at the research that's being done in brain-computer interfaces at Neuralink and other places, I can imagine that we can construct devices that can cause representations of my thoughts to be decoded by a device. And I can imagine that they could be projected into someone else's brain through some kind of device similar to the ones that we now use for helping people who are blind to see by stimulating grids in their visual cortex. Obviously very primitive, but it shows the way. So I can wave my hands a bit and say that I could have a thought that could be picked up by this computer, mediated through an AI, and projected into your mind. And then I can say, well, that could then be done on a much larger scale. If you accept the premise that then your wife's mind and yours could be connected in any way like that, where does that take you?
Okay, so yes, so you could do this. So in principle, let's do the following. Let's imagine what I call brain bridging between your brain, Scott, and my brain, okay? So I link some yet to be invented technology that records from my neuron, let's say in my visual brain in the back, and sends a wire to your visual brain in your back. And that sends, reads out my left inferior frontal gyrus, let's say where my speech area is, and links it to your speech area and vice versa, okay? So you might know we have what's called a corpus callosum. Those are 200 million fibers that link the left hemisphere of the brain with the right hemisphere. And so we could do something in principle as a thought experiment that I link my brain to your brain and I turn on this brain bridge. So early on, what I would experience, and vice versa, you would be, I see what I see. Right now, I see you in the Zoom box. I still see what I see, and then I see it's like augmented reality. I see your view superimposed. Now, of course, you move your eyes in unpredictable ways, so it could be quite jarring because I see my view, which the one I always see, which of course is relative to me stationary. And then every time you move your head or your eyes, I see superimposed this rapidly saccading image. But I would still be me and you would still be you. I would just say, interesting, Scott is looking at me, all right? And then I could do the same, let's say, with the sense of touch. So we could link our somatosensory cortices. So if I grab this, for example, you would feel it too. And something like this seems to be happening, in fact, in your province, British Columbia. There's a pair of twins, what are they called? Horgan twins. Tatiana and something other, Horgan, I think. They are twins that were born due to birth defect with conjoined brains, extremely rare. So not just skull, but conjoined brains at the level of the thalamus. So they actually have a thalamic bridge, extremely rare. And these two individuals, because they seem to be individuals most of the time, they run around and they are connected at the level of their brains. Difficult to imagine, but it's a true case. And the mom claims, and the New York Times did an interview, and there's a video, you can see him online in this video running around. It's like 7-year-old girls. They're still two individuals. But then as I increase the bandwidth of this bridge, so I link our auditory cortices, I link our sense of self and all of that, at some point, certainly according to the theory of consciousness that I helped to build, integrated information theory, there will come an abrupt point when maybe I just add one more axon connecting my brain, one more wire connecting my brain and your brain, where suddenly you, Scott, disappears. You cease to exist, and I, Christof, cease to exist as conscious entity. Instead, there will be this new mind, this, if you want, this uber mind, this amalgamated mind that is part you and part me. That's sort of an amalgamation of you and I, of your experience. There will be only one experience. It will have two perspectives, namely from your view and from my view. It will have 4 hands. It can speak through 2 mouths, etc. In fact, it's really strikingly similar to what happens in our 2 brains. And of course, you probably know that these rare cases when due to epileptic seizures spreading from one hemisphere to the other, the neurosurgeon cuts these connections completely, severs the 2 brain halves. It's called split brain. And then as far as we know, there are 2 minds now inside this one skull. So again, this could happen here too. If I turn off this bandwidth, then instantaneous, you become you again, the regular Scott, although now with these additional memories of what happened before, and I would still become me. So in this way, you could experience what another person experienced, but of course, you're not the same anymore because Scott is now not Scott, but Scott Christof, this new entity. And then it's going to be a while before we can do it in humans, but we can probably start doing this in the next 10 or 20 years in mice or other smaller animals. So this is something that could be done and that probably will be done in the fullness of time.
Given the fact that we can now deduce what text people are thinking of or what they're listening to through electrocorticograms and AI that has been trained on the results of those, I'm thinking about the possibility that we could transfer language of some form between brains quite a bit sooner than that, human brains.
Yeah, that's not going to happen over the next 50 years. I mean, if you look at all that, reading out EG, that takes place in subjects that have to do, because our techniques are still incredibly crude. You have to average over a lot of time. In fact, Facebook gave up this program. They had this very large investment in using portable EEG to predict people's commands. They wanted to do a readout of video games using EEG. It doesn't work. It hasn't worked so far. And so, yes, in principle, in the fullness of time, we might be able to do that, but not for the next 30, 40, 50 years. And yeah, the best way to do it is to put a brain implant into people's head. But of course, most people are going to be resistant to that. And the technology, even this really cool technology that Neuralink has pioneered, so far it's in exactly 3 people. 3 people that are paralyzed. So neurotechnology is progressing, but it's very slow because of the attendant scientific, methodologically, clinical, legal, ethical constraints.
Let's talk about what might be transferred over those links, though. I want to ask about language and the role of language in understanding ourselves, because we can't have this conversation without language. So I don't know of any way of talking to you about communication that doesn't involve language. I don't know what my brain was like before I had language. I have no way of describing that. But I do wonder whether it's possible to pull out thoughts from the human brain that are pre-language, because I do have this sense before I say a sentence that it is formed in my brain half a second before I start talking, and that something like the next 20 or 30 words have already been decided in that moment, and that might be something that doesn't contain language. I wonder if this is in your wheelhouse.
Yeah, so there are people like Eddie Chang at UCSF here in San Francisco that are sort of constructing readouts from both left and right frontal gyrus in patients that are aphasic. Once again, these are implants where they can predict, where they can help these people who cannot speak but whose brain is still intact, that they express, they know what they want to think, but they can't articulate the right motor patterns, that you can read these things out. So again, that's still very much experimental, but that's happening now. The question, of course, to what extent can we think in non-linguistic terms? Because we are speaking apes through and through, and all of our science, our literature, in fact, basic things like mathematics are all formulated in symbols and in linguistic processing. So it's not quite clear what it means to have, and it's this entire field of debate that people are thinking, can you have any meaningful high-level communication about abstract things like metaphysics or existence or mathematics or quantum mechanics without words? Certainly not people as we think of them today. Maybe in the future, who knows?
Well, to go into that philosophical realm there, if Descartes says, I think, therefore I am, but he uses language to do that, then isn't he saying, I language, therefore I am?
Yeah, because that's how he has to express himself. But he also, very explicit, Descartes, where he talks about thinking and seeing and loving and hearing, I think, in the original Discours de la Méthode. Yeah, but ultimately, of course, the way I communicate stuff to you is by language, by words, or by verbal or by written words. Yes, that's the way we communicate. So the question is, can we do that without language?
Okay, so Descartes is tacking on all of those other qualia, what he's feeling, seeing, hearing, that's not linguistic. It's not simply the act of being able to say, I think, therefore I am, that creates existence.
Correct, because that would exclude, if we define it in that way, then only speaking adults truly exist. Then someone who had a stroke wouldn't exist. A pre-linguistic child that can't talk yet wouldn't exist for themselves, and of course animals wouldn't exist. No, he's very careful not just to die. In fact, most people, if you ask them, try to define consciousness, most people would say, well, it relates to self. I know I'm a man, I know what I had for breakfast, I know I'm going to die one day, and I can project myself into the future and into the past. But that's really only a very narrow aspect of consciousness that typically is expressed in people, in adults, right? Consciousness is much broader than just consciousness of self. It includes just raw toothache, just a sheer, bloody, simple, nothing particular computational, sophisticated about it. When you have that pounding molar, everything else recedes in irrelevance, and that is a highly conscious experience, just of pain. And that we share, I think, with most animals. And by that measure, most animals are conscious, not necessarily of self, because only adults really have that. A little child isn't very conscious of self. A baby certainly is no evidence that we have that baby's conscious of self, but it's clearly conscious.
Thank you. That's the end of the first half of the interview. How intense is a discussion that starts out with, I'm conscious, therefore I exist, and gets deeper from there. I felt my consciousness expanding just from the conversation. In today's news, ripped from the headlines about AI, researchers at several US universities and companies have come up with what they call soft thinking, a new method that helps large language models reason more like humans by working with abstract concepts instead of just stringing words together. Traditional LLMs think one word at a time using a fixed vocabulary. This can limit their reasoning, especially in tasks with uncertainty or multiple valid approaches. Soft thinking enhances standard chain of thought reasoning by replacing discrete token sampling with concept tokens, probability distributions over the entire vocabulary. Instead of choosing a single word at each step, soft thinking allows the model to explore several reasoning paths at once, leading to more flexible, accurate thinking. A so-called cold stop mechanism tells the model when it's confident enough to stop reasoning, saving time and reducing output length. The code is publicly available. Next week, we'll conclude the interview with Christof Koch, when we'll talk about a theory of consciousness that Christof is a primary researcher of, integrated information theory. Tools for detecting and measuring consciousness, the magic number phi, the possibility of consciousness transfer, philosophical zombies, and neural correlates of consciousness. That's next week on AI and You. Until then, remember, no matter how much computers learn how to do, it's how we come together as humans that matters.
That's all for this episode of AI and You. Please leave a rating and comment and share with your friends. Get the book Artificial Intelligence and You and see more videos and articles at aiandyou.net. That's aiandyou.net, where you can also send us your questions. Thank you for listening.